Good evening, everyone. My name is Christy Moss, and I serve as the Vice President of Membership and Marketing for the University of Illinois Alumni Association. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. We are looking forward to another great session of our ongoing Alumni College speaker series. But before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I want to take a moment to talk about some exciting things happening at the Alumni Association. We continue to see a lot of excitement surrounding our annual paid membership program and the premier benefits that our members receive. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to log online and visit us at uiaa.org/membership to learn more about all of our great benefits and to sign up today. For those of you on the webinar who may be Life Association members, please know you have access to all of our current benefits at no additional cost. We're so grateful for the investment you've made with your Life membership, and we will honor that investment by offering you this current suite of benefits. We also have some great opportunities to engage all alumni with us, even if you haven't signed up for membership yet. You can visit alumnilink.illinois.edu to join our online networking and mentorship platform, where you can connect with thousands of fellow alumni from around the world. You can also join our online book club by visiting tbc.guru/UIllinois. Joining the book club is free and provides our alumni with an opportunity to connect with one another over shared interests in literature, history, and professional development. Finally, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I'd like to remind everyone to please submit questions during the presentation via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will have time left at the end of our presentation for questions, and we will get through as many as possible in the time allotted. Now, for the reason we have all logged on tonight, which is to hear from another esteemed member of our Illinois faculty, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for this evening, Michael LeRoy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael LeRoy, the LER Professor of Labor and Employment Relations at our university and an affiliated faculty member of the College of Law. His distinguished career is marked by the evolving dynamics of employment, the intersection of labor with technology, and the pressing issues of immigration. Professor LeRoy is a celebrated academic here at the University of Illinois, where he completed both his master's and bachelor's degree from us before going on to North Carolina, Chapel Hill to complete his JD. Professor LeRoy's expertise spans across a wide array of topics, including sports and entertainment law, the gig economy, and arbitration, just to name a few. His prolific contributions to legal scholarship are evident through his recent publications in prominent law reviews, his active engagement in pivotal legal debates. In the news, Professor LeRoy's insights are frequently sought, illuminating the nuances of complex legal issues from the collegiate athletics landscape to the implications of national labor policies. As a trailblazer whose work challenges and inspires, Professor LeRoy continues to leave an indelible mark on the fields of labor law and employment relations. Let's extend a hearty Illinois welcome to Professor Michael LeRoy.
Thank you so much, Christy. It's a joy and a pleasure to be with you. Before we get going on our slides, I want to say that I come to you as a member of an alumni family. I met my wife at Florida Avenue Residence. I was a sophomore; she was a freshman. Neither one of us thought much of each other. But eventually we got married and we had 3 kids. All of our kids are grown. All of our kids are Illinois grads, and they have married. 2 of them have married Illinois grads, and 1 is almost certainly going to marry an Illinois grad. And we had our 8-year-old granddaughter out who is already talking about coming to Illinois. So it's a joy and a pleasure to be here. And I would also tell you that I would remind us that our university, our great university, has a motto. And the motto is learning and labor. And I think it's fitting that we are doing that tonight. We're learning, and we're learning about labor. So I'm going to get rolling here. Well, in any event, let's start at the beginning of strikes. I don't know if you'll be as surprised as I was, but I was surprised to learn of a strike that occurred in the year 1381. Strikes are not new. Strikes, by the way, are the withholding of labor. And so I want to take you back to the 1300s. No, I was not a faculty member then. But during that time, sadly, Europe experienced the bubonic plague, and roughly 30 to 40% of the population died as a result of this plague. And it left a huge and acute shortage of labor. And so in England, the statute of laborers was enacted. And if you are mature enough to remember the 1970s, I am, you will remember that President Nixon had something called wage and price controls, which was a way to moderate inflation by literally restricting the amount of pay raises that could be given to workers. That concept originates at least back to 1351 with the statute of laborers. But to bring this story forward, eventually peasants revolted against working for too little money, too hard, and too long. And so we have a long history of strikes in what we now call the Western world. I want to move us forward rapidly in time to the craft of shoemaking as it came to America, primarily from England, where we saw the very first strike on American soil. It happened in 1794. It involved the cordwainers of Philadelphia. A cordwainer, the term cord, if you're into shoes and high quality shoes, you'll know that cordovan is a type of leather and color, and cord came from the primary leather made for shoes. These shoemakers went on strike, again, because their wages were low and because of an influx of migratory labor. And we see that dynamic playing out in our current period. We have a huge surge of migrants. They're seeking work. We see a mixed reaction by labor to this. Part of it is sympathetic, part of it is concerned about downward pressure on wages. This played out in the 1790s. And in 1806, we had the first trial involving a strike, and it really presaged the sort of the divide in labor law between Democrats, who are essentially pro-worker, and Republicans, who are essentially pro-employer. The strike was ruled to be a criminal conspiracy. I'll take a minute and just reflect on that. It was ruled to be a criminal conspiracy because it cut off the supply of shoes from the population. And at that point, that was considered an economic crime against the people of Philadelphia. That thinking is not foreign today. I see elements of that coming back into the picture. And we may touch on that later, but that sort of frames where we are coming into the modern era. And so now we're really going to advance the timeline to the pandemic. And I know I've got some former students. I want to say thanks for being here, and friends of mine, but also people I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. I want you to think back on what you were doing during the pandemic. You probably had some version of being at home, even if you're retired or if you were working. And so I think when we talk about the year 2023, the year of the strike, I think what we have to keep in mind is that we had the year before it was the year of the Great Resignation. That's what labor economists call it. And I work with several wonderful labor economists here. So you're looking at a chart, and the chart is going to show you month by month a progression. The lighter color numbers and line represent the year 2020, which is, as you recall, March 2020 was the onset of the pandemic, and then essentially lockdowns in many places. And then 2021, which was the delayed effect. But in 2020, we had a relatively normal incidence of job turnover. So we had about 28, 29 million people exit the labor market, oftentimes re-entering, but they were quitting their jobs. In 2021, that number soared to a record 42 million. And by the way, some of them couldn't work. and so forth. Now, I don't know if Christy's got this available here, but we're going to talk about. I looked at this this morning to do some final prep for this evening. The U.S. Department of Labor has a data series called the American Use of Time Survey. This is really interesting. Listen carefully to this. It's looking at the year 2022. It's asking some basic questions. Did you work at home or did you work in person during 2022? Here's some numbers. 34% of all of us as Americans did some or all of our work at home in the year 2022. If we worked strictly from home, we worked 5.4 hours. That tells me people were being honest in answering the survey. You don't work 8 hours if you're at home. I didn't, I have to confess. But if you're physically at work, you can't hide out. And so the survey shows that people work 7.9 hours if they were in a workplace. But I want us to think about that. Homework, or we call it remote work, was a kinder, softer, gentler kind of thing, although it played on our emotions. Being at work was really stressful if, especially before we had the vaccines, and even if we had the vaccines, that itself became stressful. Now, one more layer of data. If you then take all of the respondents and ask them, how much education did you complete? A huge disparity. We found that, or the U.S. Department of Labor found that 54% of all workers with a bachelor's degree or higher worked some or all the time at home. Only 18% of workers who don't have a college degree were able to work some or all the time at home. Now, what I'm getting at is that going into the year 2023, the American workforce was extremely stressed out for almost polar or opposite reasons. Some people were working too long. Some people were not working enough. Some people were so used to receiving the COVID pay supplements that they lost interest in going to work. Others said it's filling a gap for me. But I think that helps to set up what we saw. We saw a very unusual year in 2023. How unusual was it? Well, there are three charts that I've put together. If we look at the chart on the left, this is a long time series. It involves big strikes involving 1,000 or more workers. The U.S. Department of Labor collects data on the big strikes. So you're looking at basically a 65, 66-year run. And in the through the 1960s, early 1970s, it was common to have 250 to 400 big strikes a year. That's like one big strike a day. I mean, that's unimaginable, to be honest with you, today. And then they sharply ticked down in the early 1980s. Why? The long story short is because we had a very high unemployment problem, 12, 13%. Unions don't go on strike and can't go on strike during unemployment. And then when President Reagan came to office, a union named PATCO, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, they went on an illegal strike. That's not an opinion. That it's true. A federal union cannot go on strike. These workers went on strike, and President Reagan hired over 10,000 replacements for them. This was thought unimaginable at the time. I remember this well. I was in law school. It was just an amazing thing to see. But it seemed to, and people divide, their opinions are very divided. But I think where there isn't a division of opinion is that response to an unlawful strike seems to have encouraged other large employers to hire replacement workers. And much of my tenure research looked at that. And so then if you go forward on the far left timeline through the 1990s to 2000 and so forth, we're getting 30 to 40, 50 strikes a year. If you happen to be in Central Illinois, and if you happen to be of a certain age, you may remember very difficult labor disputes in Decatur and Peoria and Danville and Charleston, all involving what we had Caterpillar, we had in the UAW, we had Bridgestone Firestone and Decatur, a tire maker. We had the Staley dispute, that is a food processing company. Trailmobile in Charleston, but they all involved this dynamic of workers being on strike or being locked out. In other words, stoppages and large-scale hiring of replacement workers and continuing operations. And that really dampened the power or the ability of unions to strike. So I have to say, even though Christy gave me such a nice introduction, more than I merit or deserve, I spent the first 15, 20 years of my career doing research on a dying phenomenon, and there was no interest in what I was doing, but I did it anyway. Then we have to the right, we've got this chart on total workers on strike, and I because I want to move us along, I want us to look at the spike in strike activity for teachers in 2019 and 2020. This is really amazing for the following reason. Most of these strikes were by teachers who cannot engage in collective bargaining. This was the, quote, Red for Ed campaign. Red, as I understand it, I can't say this for certainty, stood for red states. And so in these states without collective bargaining, where teachers do not have a teachers union as such, they have an association, teachers walked out of the classroom. They went to the state house, and they were there by the tens of thousands to demonstrate in support of increased funding for public education, including their salaries. And I just offer that for an illustration of people do not have to be in a union to engage in a work stoppage. Certainly, most of the times, that's what happens, but it wasn't the case then. So what do we have? Now we're at the core of why we're here this evening. What happened in 2023? We had a nearly 300% increase in strike activity. Now, on the one hand, we have to remember it's not hard to get to 300% when you're coming off a real small number. Okay, but in any event, we had a number 424 work stoppages that looks like the 1970s. And we've got hundreds of thousands of workers on strike. I don't think you have to jog your memory or imagination much to remember what some of these strikes involved or were about. We're going to talk first about the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild. And these are strikes. These are unions that relate to entertainment primarily, to a degree, other broadcasting and convention, like a convention center has a show and so forth. But we're essentially talking about Hollywood and TV. The writers went out on strike, and then they were followed, about 2.5 months later by the Screen Actors Guild. Now, these two unions, I think when my successor 100 years from now presents for the University of Illinois Alumni Association, and they have one of these historical slides, they will look back on these two unions striking to say it was the first strike over artificial intelligence and over concerns about streaming on the internet. So let me explain what that's about. If you can go back in time with me, we used to see movies at a movie theater. And the way that actors would be paid would be directly for their hours spent on a production. And then we got to the point, and I was a parent of young kids at the time, where you're buying videos. And so you're bringing home the Disney video, or you're getting it from Blockbuster. Remember Blockbuster? But the point I'm trying to make is we had these sort of DVD and CD and similar extensions, which created a new revenue stream that fell outside of the theater. All right. And that created a problem for the union because there was a leakage there wasn't a leakage per se, that'll come up in just a minute, but they felt that they were not being rewarded for the fruits of their labor, i.e., you'd have shows that are in a limited production or run at a theater, and then it goes into a DVD, and then it goes global, and the studio gets all the money and the workers don't. So in or about 2008, I'm not exactly sure, there was an intense negotiation around that. and the workers won a collective bargaining agreement in which they got residuals. So as long as you could count the number of DVDs, CDs that were leaving the distribution, or it's put into the distribution channel, the actors got a percentage of that distribution. Now we look at both the pandemic and the convergence of a new technology, streaming technologies, which were there before the pandemic. I don't know about you. I was at home a lot watching Netflix and Amazon, and I'm not even that kind of person. I don't do this. But the point I'm trying to make is every time we're repeating a show, there's no residual for the actor, nor is there a residual for the writer. And that really teed up what this particular these concurrent strikes were about. So as a result of the technology, a couple things of note happened. One, there were fewer jobs for workers because streaming had moved the locus of production from a traditional studio, like a studio lot, literally in Hollywood. And then you had these upstarts, Amazon and Netflix. They're a lot leaner. They're not tied to Hollywood. They can go out of the country. They're small, lean. So they can produce and they get high quality content. So you have a sort of the worst storm for the union is a more efficient production, no union rules apply, they're not unionized, a new technology, and it's pressuring our income on the streaming end. Now, these two strikes lasted an unusually long time, and workers came out with a couple of notable victories. I think the most overarching victory that they achieved was language in their collective bargaining agreements that prevent TV shows and movie studios from using artificial intelligence to replicate their voice, their image. And I'm being candid with you. I think the day will come when professors are put in an AI format, and you can create an analog for me, probably smarter and better than me, and more engaging than me. And the same can happen for many of us who are listening to this. But this collective bargaining agreement puts a halt to that. It allows AI and very limited circumstances. All right, so let's move forward. Then, so as that's going on, just by coincidence, and I want to say what I mean by coincidence. Unions in the United States cannot go on strike unless and until their collective bargaining agreement, if they have one, has terminated. In other words, terminated is not the right word. It has expired. And then they have to give notice, intent to strike, and employers have a countervailing power to lock out workers and to create the work stoppage. It's not on my slides here, but baseball, MLB locked out baseball players, I think in December of 2021, and it went for about 2 or 3 months. It's a two-way street. It really reflects who's got bargaining power at the time that the agreement expires. But to cut to the chase here, by coincidence, now I can use that word, we had major contracts coming up for expiration in 2023. Most notably, United Parcel Service, or UPS. They didn't strike. They came so close to going on strike. Now, I want to thread back and set up what their dispute was about. Let's go back to the year 2008, 2009. You may or may not remember, but in the fall of 2008, our economy went into a nosedive. It was called the Great Recession. It was brought on by the Lehman bankruptcy filing, and then there was a mortgage crisis, and all of a sudden we were in a real strong downward spiral that rippled out through the economy. And you may remember that the United States government engaged in a controversial action to bail out the auto industry. Libertarians and conservatives say it's not the role of government to do that. more moderate people politically, or centrist, I should say, or Democrats said, let's be practical here. I mean, we've got to save these jobs. The government has a role to play. By the time President Obama came into office, he took the view that there should be a quote bailout. We had the bailout. Now, what happened on the labor front is in our factories, we had a two-tier wage system. So new hires came in on what was called a B scale. And the B scale was essentially 40 to 50% of the A scale. And it made perfect sense in its time, meaning older workers are going to retire. You replace them with younger workers. They come in. The auto companies then are lean. They have low costs of production. They can pay back their loans, which they did. All good. But now you carry that out into like 15 years later when the auto companies are making each over 10 to $15 billion in profits a year, and you still have the B tier workers. That becomes a problem for the UAW. The United Parcel Service was not directly involved in that. They have a different story. Their story is really quite fascinating in my mind. UPS, their major competitor, well, recently it's Amazon, but more traditionally it's FedEx. FedEx is non-union. And FedEx has often, I can't say always, utilized an independent contractor model. So when you see a FedEx truck in your neighborhood, if you look carefully, you might see something like this truck is leased to such and such. And what that means is the driver has entered into an agreement to borrow money from FedEx or provider, but the driver is being paid mileage and a rate, but is not an employee. And if you're not an employee, you cannot be a union. You don't qualify to join a union under the National Labor Relations Act. So I'm framing this for you because UPS, in response to this intense price competition from a non-union competitor, caused them to have a part-time scale. They grew out their part-time workforce and they shrank their full-time workforce. So what the strike was about was moving the part-time workers. This is sort of like the B tier or the B scale workers in the auto industry up. And so that settlement involved a major reclassification of part-time. They can still be part-time, but they went from $16 to $21 an hour upon signing the agreement. And then a 48% overall increase in pay for part-time workers over the life of the 5-year, it's a 4 or 5 year contract. The full-time drivers at the top end of the scale make $49 an hour. I want to repeat that, $49 an hour. I think that's a good news story and a not so good news story. If you do 2,000 hours of work times $50 an hour, you've got a 6-figure delivery worker. Now, if you watch a UPS worker, and it's the same for Amazon and FedEx, but they really move fast and they are extremely productive. But there's higher costs. So good news for them. Good news for restoring a middle class. Are they going to be price competitive in the future? We'll have to see. And the UAW had a similar settlement. They earned a 33% increase over the life of their CBA. The top tier workers are going to make $42 an hour. Ford Motor has said, well, this is going to add about $900 in labor costs to every vehicle we sell. So we're going to, we're looking at inflation in our economy. I'm not an economist. I do know that there's not a single cause for inflation, but there's little or no question that these wage agreements will have some kind of inflationary impact. But, this strike, so I would get interviewed about this. And I want to comment briefly on the University of Illinois. We're one of the few schools that has a so-called labor school. And so I get more attention than I deserve because there are hardly any people anymore. There are hardly any labor schools and hardly any labor law research professors. And that's just a reality. But as I would be interviewed, I would start to say, that this is something like a strike contagion. I think there's something to the contagion metaphor, which means that when 2 or 3 unions go on strike successfully, other unions are emboldened. It's sort of the reverse of the Patco effect with President Reagan in the 1980s. It's kind of the mirror image of that. But in the healthcare industry, and in healthcare, I want to focus on the primary complaint among nurses and tertiary or secondary healthcare and even physicians is overwork. They don't have any respite. They can't get time off. Not to mention their pay isn't keeping up. And so we had a major strike with Kaiser Permanente, a unionized healthcare provider in the West Coast states, Colorado, Washington, D.C. And as you can see from the screen, they improved too. It looks like, $21 to $25 an hour is the going rate for the bottom rate of a collective bargaining agreement. All right. Now there are some spin-off effects, and we're gonna get to some questions, in about 5 to 10 minutes, I think. But let me tell you what's trending now or what to watch for in 2024. The Supreme Court has docketed a case involving Starbucks. Starbucks has had over 400 stores, if I can call them that, where workers have voted to form a union. I want to stop for just a minute and say, research shows that unions form much more easily in smaller workplaces than larger ones. Why do you think that's so? The answer is that people can communicate more readily. I'm talking about workers. And if they have a shared interest, it's easier to stay together. Whereas in a large workplace, you're going to have more cleavages just by age, gender, ethnicity, skill set, longevity on the job. So unions have learned, and I talk to union organizers, and they say that for them, the sweet spot is a workplace with 50 to 100 employees. And more than one union organizer has told me, we never organize a good employer. It's only employers who lose the trust or faith of their workers. Those are the ones that they say there are lots of good employers out there, and they don't see a need there's no point in organizing them. Well, for whatever reason, Starbucks workers have become unhappy at some stores. They have formed a union. Now, what the Supreme Court is looking at is a particular case out of Memphis, where 7 or 8 workers who they were on strike but came into the store and opened the store after hours. Excuse me, they weren't on strike. They opened the store after hours, and they were fired. They opened the store to the media, so they did interviews in there to talk about their grievances. The National Labor Relations Board went to court under the National Labor Relations Act and was granted an injunction to put those workers back on the job. Starbucks had fired them for violating a store rule. Now, this seems like an arcane dispute. It is. But what this involves is, does the National Labor Relations Act empower the labor board to cause an employer to reinstate a worker? So this would, you might say, so what do you think is going to happen? I think unions are going to lose that case. The NLRB will lose that power. So then you might say, so what does that mean for workers? What that means is if they're fired for breaking a rule, they may be out of work for 5, 6, 7 years because the NLRB has a very slow process. And then if you extrapolate that out, it will put negative pressure on unions to even organize or strike, because the price of organizing or going on strike will be losing your job and hoping 6 years from now you get reinstated with back pay. I want to look at the picture on the top left. That's Amazon's fulfillment center. And it's I think that's the one by JFK that formed a union. This was an unbelievable event in the labor world because it was a large It's a huge workplace. There were something like 4,600 workers voted in this thing, 2,500 for the union, about 2,100 against the union or for Amazon. Amazon, at a lower level in the judicial process, is now arguing that the National Labor Relations Act is unconstitutional. Now, I know we're diving into the deep end of the pool here, but I just want to say, to employers, I would say, be careful what you wish for, because our labor laws have evolved to the point where we have controls on strikes. Before the National Labor Relations Act was enacted, we had 2,200 to 2,500 strikes a year. You saw that slide where I showed that we had 400 strikes a year, albeit among large employers. In any event, I think losing the National Labor Relations Act would return us to sort of the law of the street and the parking lot, and it would create a lot of disruptions in our economy. And so I'm hopeful. I mean, I can understand the Starbucks argument, and I do understand Amazon's frustration with the National Labor Relations Board. But again, I would respectfully ask them to look at some history and say, do you want to go back to that kind of intense environment where you have to call in federal troops to put down a labor dispute? So that's kind of where we are. And then, I've just flashed up a slide here. Dartmouth, the basketball team has formed a union. I'll comment at that real briefly. I get asked a lot of questions on this. What does it mean? Yes, it's a big deal. It's the second time. Northwestern was the first time. This is the second time college athletes have voted to form a union. Do I think it's going to really change things like at the Big Ten level? I don't think this will. I want us to understand that under the National Labor Relations Act, it covers only private sector employers. All right. So if you think about Northwestern, and the football players wanted to form a union in 2014, it's a private school. Dartmouth is a private school. Now, what makes Dartmouth interesting is that Dartmouth is in a conference of all private schools. So there you could have a conference, form a union. And even more interesting, if all they bargained for was scholarships, the Ivy League has a rule of no scholarships, no athletic scholarships. This is a question I pose in class. What would happen if they, just said, we want to do that? What I'm getting at is you could have, it'd be an oddball case, but you could have unions in a conference where there's no violation of NCAA rules, because all the athletes are asking for would be educational benefits paid for by the school within the confines of the NCAA rules. That makes it interesting. And of course, people want to speculate, is this the tip of the spear? I don't know. I'll leave it there. So let me just check our time here. Let me start to wind things down and take some questions from you all. This is sort of a summary of the articles I've put together. But I think I'm not going to talk about these in any kind of way. If you look at the top left, creating order out of chaos and other partial and intermittent strikes. Let me just tell you briefly what I was looking at there. There are an increasing number of situations where people walk off the job for a day or two. This is really, strikes in hospitals are very uncommon, but they do happen. And I've seen this in the past year. So nurses are not going to walk out for an indefinite period of time, but they'll walk out for a day or two. And so that is called an intermittent strike. A partial strike would be something like workers say, I'll work my 8-hour shift, but I'm not working overtime. Okay, but I'll be back tomorrow and pick up on my regular shift. I just want to sort of tie this part of the conversation off by saying, in 2022, I talked with a union and an employer together in the same room about their experiences the year before during the height of the pandemic. The workers were put on the schedule sometimes for up to 31 consecutive days. And the employer hated to do it. They did not have a choice. And so we talked about it, and it was a good conversation. And the long story short is the employer, ahead of schedule, gave workers a 10% raise in an effort to hire more people. But what I am getting at is, I think one of the core reasons that people go on strike today, it's about money. But I want to go back to that sort of, how much time do you spend at home versus at work? Going into the pandemic, Americans were working the greatest number of hours since the U.S. Department of Labor had kept records. And if you look at the Great Resignation, the idea of burnout comes into play. So when you look at a partial or intermittent strike, what I think you're looking at is sort of the quickie version, the short and quick version. I'm not ready to leave my job, but I am ready to leave work when the whistle blows at 5 o'clock, and that kind of thing. Okay, so I want to leave us with about a minute and a half slide. And a student of mine shared this in a presentation earlier this semester. I was blown away. You're going to look at Tesla's robotics lab where my student worked. On that cheery note, let me just say that this whole subject could be made moot if we have an army of robotic workers in our factories, as baristas at Starbucks, you name it, for professors. And so that's sort of a teaser for us to think about, is how automation is going to displace jobs. In the legal industry, there are some predictions that up to 90% of legal jobs will be displaced in the next 10 to 20 years. There's a lot of repetitive work that AI can do. Contract writing is key among them, but writing wills, things like this. So, when we look back, 2023 might be the high water mark of the year of the strike. And so, Christy, I shot past the time I know that we talked about, but I will be quiet now and field questions.
Well, actually, our first question comes from somebody who writes in and says, what impact do you think AI will have on unionization and strikes?
Yeah, well, I don't have a crystal ball. I do think that AI, if we just use the SAG and the writers, they recognized the threat to their work in time. Now they have a lot of bargaining power that the rest of us don't have. But to make a long story short, I think it'll have a real depressing effect on forming unions. On the one hand, it will stimulate concern, anxiety. Remember I said about 15 minutes ago, union organizers say that a good employer is not a good target for unionizing. But if a good employer all of a sudden is taking away your job with a robot or a program, then you could get that. For a union to be successful, they need to have to be a voice of protest. So I think long term, not a bright future. But I would also say unions have dealt with this technology threats for 500 years, and they still are around.
Right. Right. Well, our next question is, do you think the number of workers who were part of a union in private sector will ever return to the high rates we saw in the past?
No. No. So that's a really astute question. The highest rate was about 33% of the private sector in 1954, 1955. Today, the private sector is unionized at about 6 or 7%. In fact, unions have given up on that. And so you might say, what? What are they doing? And so if you look at the unions are engaging in what's called sector co-regulation. So that's a fancy term for, if you look at the fast food industry in California, it's almost entirely non-union, but unions are very powerful in the legislative process, and they enact wages. So they've raised the wage floor for those workers. So that idea of sector, here's a sector, it's called the fast food industry. Co-regulation means that you're going to have a union, in effect, using the General Assembly as a proxy for the union's power to give people a better wage, is what it is.
Right, right. Okay, our next question is, do you have any thoughts about President Biden standing with the UAW in their strike against the automakers?
I do. I mean, it was an extraordinary moment if you follow labor stuff. And my next thought is, it may not help them all that much. I, you know, I, these are such difficult times to figure out. They just are. And so even within the UAW, there's unhappiness with Biden because of his heavy promotion of EVs, electric vehicles. An electric vehicle takes only 70% of the labor of what's called an ICE car, an internal combustion engine car. So from an auto worker's perspective, some see Joe Biden as a job killer. And this isn't rhetoric. I mean, that's going to be true. On the other hand, unions and union members who are interested in strong labor laws, they should be gravitating to Biden. And I will say, in the first year I worked as a professor here, I had a mentor who told me, he's just telling me honestly, he said, you're going to talk to a lot of people in the labor movement. He said, 40% of them, labor stuff doesn't mean anything to them. They are into other issues besides labor issues. And so, I do think it's momentous, its long-term effect. Yeah, I'm a little skeptical about its long-term effect, to be honest.
We have another question here. More and more physicians are becoming employed by hospitals. What factors traditionally kept physicians from unionizing, and how might that change as more are being employed?
Well, first of all, up until that's a good question. I can't remember the year, but for a long time, Elamycinary institutions, which is shorthand for hospitals and similar, were excluded as employers under the National Labor Relations Act. So a doctor couldn't even form a union. And this is an astute question because typically a hospital didn't employ a doctor. Typically a doctor was in her or his own practice and had privileges at a hospital. But now with the massive consolidation in healthcare, you've got what is called the commodification of healthcare services. So I have a colleague who is looking at AI. We got to get this colleague to do an alumni association talk. But she's looking at how certain kinds of work are algorithmically managed, including healthcare, which is, a doctor is told you've got X number of minutes, here's the script. And so that is creating the unhappiness among some physician groups. But the main point I want to make, and I hope I'm responsive to the question, you're going to repeat it to me in just a minute, is now the employer is more directly in the line of being the employer. Okay. Because the hospital has bought up these practices. Alina Healthcare, I think I've got the pronunciation right, in Wisconsin had a union vote by physicians, a big number, like 400 voted for a union last year. That would be inconceivable even 20 years ago, just inconceivable. But then if you look at when I was growing up, the thought was, boy, if you wanted to be wealthy and high status, you would be a physician. And with all due respect to any physicians who are listening today, be a crypto trader or something if you want to make a lot of money. Being a physician, that's a lot of work and education, and the pay isn't great and the hours are not so great. But saving lives is great.
Right, right. Well, we've got time, I think, for one final question. How do you see California's right to disconnect law impacting labor practices in California and in the nation?
Okay, I gotta say, these, when you see the Olympics and they say, "Oh, that's like a 4-point axle spin or something," these are tough questions. But thank you. So, what
Great
this right to
alumni.
Of course. Why should I be surprised? There are 13 countries that have passed right to disconnect laws starting in 2018. I think France was one of the earliest. But the gist of the law is at a certain time, the idea is at a certain point, an employee has a legal right not to answer a text, not to answer the phone, whatever, go online and just be 24/7, 365 available. The United States typically is behind on labor law stuff, even though we think that we're progressive and all this. We're compared to others, no, we're not. But California has an effort by a Democratic assembly person. And the gist of it is, I think it's kind of a half measure. What it would do is say that essentially a worker and his or her boss is such a supervisor, or employer could enter into an agreement and it would be enforceable. It's sort of a dip your toe in the water. I think the question is, what would it do for unions? I think this is another illustration of this is the kind of thing you would expect unions to negotiate in the private sector because it matters to people. If 6% are unionized, it's not going to happen. So I put it in the camp of like the fast food, the sector co-regulation. This is another, when it's co-regulation, what this is I'll be honest with you, it's Democrats and union allies enacting legislation in the absence of, there's sort of like a proxy union. And you can see the way that Republicans react to it is predictably, hey, what about the free market? What about choice? And why are you dictating to us? So that's my best sense of it.
Right. Well, this has been illuminating. And on behalf of all of the alumni who've logged on to hear you this evening, thank you, Professor LeRoy. And thank you, all of our alumni and friends who are here and who participate in these wonderful kind of talks. Just wanted to say thank you again for being here. And you will be receiving in your email, you'll be receiving a survey. Please fill out our survey to provide us feedback. This helps us know the types of individuals you want to have and come speak for these types of things. Again, thank you, Professor LeRoy, and we will see all of you again soon.